The presentation I've prepared for you, dear historians, is a somewhat more academic version with the same intro of the full evening's entertainment on my Lesbian Pulp paperbacks that I started providing in 1980. This presentation is called My Life in the Pulps by Robin Cohen. Previously, I did a presentation called Tripping Over Our Roots. I did that presentation from 1980 through the 2000s. The first thing people ask me about the books I'll be presenting is, how did you find them? In 1978, while working on a kibbutz in Israel, I used to frequent their small multi-language library of donated books after a hard day's work in their pickle factory. One evening, while perusing the shelves, one English book cover leaped out at me. The spine said, "I am a woman." It looked like one of those 1950s Total Woman kind of books on how to be a lady. But when I pulled it out, I saw this book cover. "I'm a woman in love with a woman. Must society reject me?" Just imagine my surprise. There I was, thousands of miles from home, and I found this lesbian novel I'd never heard of before, with a publication date of 1959 yet. This novel was unlike any contemporary lesbian fiction I'd read. I felt like I was reading my own story at last, that of a confused young woman wrestling with her lesbian feelings alone, knowing no one else like herself. The inside cover listed other novels by the same author, and so began my detective work, and what turned out to be a lifelong detective work. As I hunted for more of these novels in Israel and then back in the States, I started to uncover an inheritance, a wealth of lesbian herstory, a documentation of the lives and struggles of women who came before us, found each other, built a community that laid the groundwork for Stonewall and the subsequent LGBT movement. For many women of the 1960s, 50s, and even earlier, these books were a main network to finding, and most often the only way to finding, other women like themselves. Some were previously written, well-crafted literature by lesbian authors, reprinted in 1950s paperbacks with lurid covers and new titles appealing to the public's curiosity about the mysterious twilight world of homosexuality, actually specifically only about lesbians. Others, the majority we'll see, paperback original pulp novels written by struggling authors strictly for the burgeoning post-war, low-cost paper pulp paperback market. In the 1970s, as I was discovering these forgotten books, independently trying to identify and refine their hidden authors, a few other lesbian collectors were doing the same. Another collector, Barbara Greer, started later Naiad Press, a lesbian publishing house, and eventually reprinted a few. Most were never reprinted, but nonetheless are a priceless part of our herstory. As you look at the covers, remember these books were more available than hardback books and sold everywhere, in drugstores, bus stations, newsstands, and exemplify the way lesbians were viewed at that time.
We kiss in a shadow, we hide from the moon. Our meetings are few and over too soon. We speak in a whisper, afraid to be heard. When people are near, we speak not a word. Alone in our secret, together we sigh for one smiling day to be free.
The first reading I would do is from Diana, A Strange Autobiography by Diana Fredericks. It was published in hardback in 1939 and reprinted in paperback in 1955 with, of course, a more colorful, lurid cover. I want to mention also that it was eventually figured out who did it because it was featured on History Detective on PBS, and you can still watch that episode by Googling it. I'm going to go on to the next one and not do any readings. Usually I would read from a scene where these two women are living alone unto themselves, avoiding or unaware of gay life. And they're living in Paris, and then the moment of truth arrives in 1939, and Jane and Diana each deals with it in her own way. The next reading, if I were doing one, would be from The Illusionist, which was published in hardback in 1951, reprinted in paperback in 1953 as The Loving and the Daring, a compelling novel of secret love. It's actually the well-written story of an adolescent's first passionate love for an older, worldly lesbian. The Scorpion by Anna Elizabeth Beyrick was first written in German in 1932 and followed a year later by a sequel called The Outcast. Both books follow the fortunes and misfortunes of a sensitive lesbian named Myra Rudloff. Reprinted during the very height of the lesbian pulp paperbacks, The Scorpion was printed more than once and eventually hacked up, called an unexpurgated excerpt, and reprinted under a new title of Love Forbidden. And once again, I'm not going to do any readings tonight. The excerpt, if I were doing it, is from early in the story when at age 20, Myra finds she's been reborn in the moment of coming out to herself. We Too Are Drifting, first published in 1935, is another literary classic. The author, Gail Wilhelm, wrote in the same economical style popularized by Hemingway. She received a fair amount of critical acclaim, especially for an author writing about lesbians. The hardback edition on the left was printed, that version of it was printed in 1945, although the original was 1933. And then you see a Lion paperback reprint in 1951, where they compare it to The Well of Loneliness, and then a Berkeley paperback in 1960. There were also printings in 55, 57, and 58, and I guarantee you the covers would have been different for every single one of those. Her second book, The Torchlight to Valhalla, also hardback in 1938, became a pulp paperback as well. First reprinted in 1953, there's a version of that printing of it. And then by 1961, they weren't even referring to the original book that it came from, just to We Too Are Drifting, which was more well known. And of course, the covers change along with the times. Now we enter into the Lesbian Pulp paperback original, PBO, in the publishing trade of this post-World War II period. The 1950s to 1960s, the heyday of the lesbian pulps phenomenon, was a true phenomenon that has never been replicated in the published industry since. Literally millions of copies of the various lesbian pulp paperbacks were printed, some with the same stories with ever-changing covers. You've already seen some that started out as pre-1950s hardbacks that were reprinted during the lesbian pulps phenomenon, but most of what was printed during the golden age of the lesbian pulps, the PBO, were written specifically to be paperbacks. And of course, no paperbacks were sold in bookstores, but everywhere across America, drugstores, bus stations, grocery store racks, readily available to all, and very inexpensively. The publishing of lesbian pulp paperbacks was inspired by this first book published in the US in 1950, the real-life experiences of a not lesbian author who wrote under her real name when she escaped from occupied France, joined other exiles, and stationed in Britain in a women's barracks in Charles de Gaulle's army. And to quote from the cover, As the Blitz rains down over London, taboos are broken, affairs start and stop, and hearts are won and lost. While lesbians and their true loves were not the whole story, and the required mild condemnation of lesbian love was included, women's barracks was banned for obscenity in several states because of the lesbian content and also denounced by the House Select Committee on Current Pornography Materials in 1952 as an example of how the paperback industry was promoting moral degeneracy. In spite, or perhaps because of this, the novel became a record-breaking paperback bestseller. Know that in hardback, which were only available in bookstores, a bestseller was considered a book that sold 30,000 copies. Well, these were not hardbacks and they weren't sold in bookstores. Women's Barracks, the paperback only, sold wherever paperbacks were found, sold 1.5 million copies in the first printing alone, and 4 million total over the multiple printings over time. There was a time when I read from this, but I don't do that anymore because no one liked a dark wartime story that wasn't a lesbian love story. So, with the huge success in 1950 of Women's Barracks, the same strictly paperback-only publisher, house just getting started, Fawcett Crest Gold Medal head, Dick Carroll approached his secretary, the young 23-year-old lesbian, to ask if she could write a 100% lesbian story. Dick Carroll's one restriction was that the book must have an unhappy ending to get past the government and post office censors. And so came her book in 1952, Spring Fire. Unlike the French author Therese Coutureuse, who used her real name, this young author did not have her real name on the book. Her real name was Mary Jane Meeker. And from this point forward, all lesbian pulps that were not former hardbacks would very wisely and of great necessity be written under pseudonyms with the real identity of any author a well-protected secret. 1952 Spring Fire broke all kinds of sales records. Men, women, everyone bought it. It sold 1.5 million copies through initial printings and thus birthed the new and very lucrative market, the lesbian pulp paperback. This involved the mining we already saw of previously well-written hardbacks into 1950s paperbacks with tawdry new covers and sometimes suggestive new titles while crediting the original author. But even more, the new lesbian pulp paperback with a pseudonymous author. Providing the commanded unhappy ending, Spring Fire sold those copies and did indeed make it past the decency and pornography censors, the McCarthy hearings, the Post Office, the federal government, which set another template for the future. With few exceptions, lesbian paperback originals would continue to follow the guideline that you would read this lovely story and then on the last 4 pages there'd be the sudden suicide or commitment to a mental institution or heterosexual marriage so that the story could conclude by condemning the perverse lifestyle of homosexuality, lesbianism specifically. Only a handful of lesbian paperback original authors were able to, for one special reason or another, circumvent these publishing house-imposed lesbian pulp restrictions. And through the 1950s, the marketing of these large production lesbian pulps continued to develop with easy-to-identify new code words: Twilight, The Other Kind, Third Way, In the Shadows, etc. So men and women knew what the subject was with just a glance at the covers. The books were inexpensive, readily available, with their small size easy to hide from prying eyes. A person could buy it at a distant bus station, hoping no one knew that you were there and you weren't recognized, and then discard it before arriving home. For better or worse, this new market created a visibility never before available on the subject of lesbians and lesbianism. So into this lesbian paperback original market came the first nonfiction book on lesbians. Previously, the only nonfiction on the subject of homosexuality, and especially including lesbianism, were hardback texts under lock and key to be signed out from libraries or limited to psychiatry tomes of those studying what was called the female deviant. In 1955, Fawcett Crest Gold Medal published these, starting with We Walk Alone Through Lesbos' Lonely Groves. in 1955 through 1972. This nonfiction series revealed and showed and was written by one person, the pseudonymous Anne Aldridge, as it says on the back cover, herself a member of the sisterhood. And that creator and author, once again, was Mary Jane Meeker, the 23-year-old former author of Spring Fire. While these were the first and only commercially available nonfiction to the general public, lesbians and women with same-sex attractions, of course the books were a reflection of the times, and they did, instead of an unhappy fiction ending, would have to include some kind of tag from a supposed medical expert. Here we have Dr. Richard H. Hoffman, world-famous psychiatrist. Here we have Dr. Harold Greenwald, psychoanalyst and author, commenting on one of the Paula Christian series. Paula Christian was a lesbian and wrote all of these during that time period under the pseudonym Paula Christian. And here we have one more. This is nothing less than a classic case of modern lesbianism, Herbert Green, MD. Even the names are similar, nice Jewish sounding, since Jews are overrepresented in the medical field. Yet, by their very existence and easy availability, the Lesbian Pulp paperbacks were an oasis in the desert, providing one and only possible outlet for isolated women all over America and even beyond our borders to find a place to connect, or at least learn that they weren't completely alone, knowing no one else like themselves, many trapped in 1950s marriages, living in small towns, never likely to make it to the very few scary Ceeme gay bars in America's biggest cities, nor wanting to, with no one else to pour their hearts out to, of the challenges and intense isolation each felt. If such a woman reader of the Pulps could muster up the courage to do so, at last they had somewhere, someone they could confide in, who they could write to of their confusing feelings, great longings, and desperate isolation. And did they ever? The book in this series, We Too Must Love, included some of the letters written both to Mary Jane Meeker and to another Pulps author I'll be talking about a little later, Anne Bannon, the most popular of the lesbian pulp authors. Along with Spring Fire in 1952, a new high-quality lesbian fiction hardback was also published, and so it too was quickly dispatched to paperback with a lesbian pulp paperback cover. That it came out in hardback indicated that it was an especially complex, well-crafted book with some gravitas. The author called herself Claire Morgan, also a pseudonym. And of course, I would be including a reading from that as well in my original show. The Price of Salt managed to be an upbeat love story of two mature women who end up happily together. One's a lesbian parent, and tragic loss of child custody is also discussed. The author was permitted her intended happy ending by her mainstream hardback publisher due to her already established hardback success. Though hidden from all and refusing to make it known for almost 40 years afterwards, Claire Morgan was a pseudonym for an accomplished author with, by 1951, a Hollywood movie already made from her books. When I first found Price of Salt, there was no way to uncover the author. It hadn't been known ever, let alone by the 1970s, when all these books were already condemned to the dust pile of our typical hidden, lost, and forgotten lesbian history. No one knew who Claire Morgan really was because, like all the other later pulpback original writers, she absolutely did not want it known. Despite numerous asks over the next 40 years, she disaffirmed any guesses and managed to keep it that way until 1984, when at age 64 she finally begrudgingly admitted to it and equally begrudgingly outed herself in the process. It was Patricia Highsmith, author of her own genre of suspense novels, the Hitchcock movie Stranger on a Train in 1951, and many more in her subsequent years, including remakes of a Ripley series. One of them, made later, was starring Matt Damon, the talented Mr. Ripley. What I also didn't know at that time, as I was finding these women, was that in the one and only, ever so tiny, most identifiable lesbian meeting place of the 1950s, in a Greenwich Village, New York City lesbian bar, Mary Jane Meeker, who wrote Spring Fire and the Ann Aldridge nonfiction series, and Patricia Highsmith, aka Claire Morgan, who she greatly admired, did meet. And in that so small lesbian 1950s world, they would, of course, become lovers as well. Though Mary Jane had to keep this a secret while the difficult Patricia Highsmith was alive, in 2003 Mary Jane made their relationship public the way writers do, by writing a fascinating tell-all memoir about their 3-year live-in relationship. Patricia's odd, dark personality and creative output is fully detailed elsewhere. By January 2021, there'll be 3 different, thorough hardback biographies on her. As for Mary Jane Meeker, after her Spring Fire nonfiction Ann Aldridge series and a couple of Vin Packer Fawcett Crest Gold Medal mysteries, she continued writing under pseudonyms and eventually became an award-winning children's books author. Her full story and over 50 books are viewable in her Wikipedia entry. She still lives in the New York City area as of this writing, the home of the American publishing industry, and is still going at 93, a Facebook friend, and though rarely asked, has been interviewed a number of times, including by Terry Gross on NPR Fresh Air. Price of Salt, long intended for contemporary Hollywood just as soon as Patricia Highsmith's 1995 death, intended by a lesbian, was shelved, reshelved, finally produced. The screen adaptation of Price of Salt was retitled Carol and finally made it in the box office in 2015, starring Cate Blanchett. These 5 books by Ann Bannon, a pseudonym of course, were published between 1957 and 1960 and are the gold standard of the lesbian pulp genre. Odd Girl Out was the second best-selling paperback of 1957. Second best-selling paperback. The series was especially successful because readers were able to follow the main characters, Laura, Beth, and the much-beloved soft-hearted Butch, Bebo Brinker, through all 5 books. The impact of these very widely distributed set of books has been incredibly far-reaching, often called the Queen of the Pulps. These were the only books she ever wrote, and in her retirement from her academic career, she has made a second career out of being Ann Bannon, possibly due to her understated personal demeanor and style. Her very young age when she wrote her book means she's lived long enough to become a pop icon, especially embraced by the LGBT community in her later life, as easily seen on her annbannon.com webpage. Ann Bannon was only 22 when she wrote the first one, a young married wife slipping away to New York City and hanging about the bars with Mary Jane Meeker as her mentor and guide to Greenwich Village, who Anne found the usual way by writing to Mary Jane through Fawcett Crest Gold Medal publisher, the one and only way to find other lesbians for so very many women of this era. At one point, Mary Jane threatened to expose Anne to her husband, which absolutely terrified Anne. And though she will discuss anything else about her emotional life, she's still not really comfortable naming her personal identity to this very day. But running back and forth between Greenwich Village and her Pennsylvania marriage, she published between 1957 and 1962 all 5 books. They were very heavily marketed by Fawcett Crest Gold Medal, and with a 1957 Supreme Court decision that preceded her and freed homosexual material finally from the risk of censorship, those long wished for happy endings were now not only possible for pulp writers, but legally protected. By the early 1960s, Ann Bannon was still the most recognizable name in lesbian fiction, or any gay fiction actually, and published under her pseudonym in 2 of the national gay publications of the time. This is one of them. And then by 1965 or so, as she definitely wished and wanted, Ann Bannon vanished entirely pretty much into thin air. In 1978, still in Israel, my partner and I found more and more of these discarded books in dusty used bookstores and organizations' donated bookshelves. We were even given some by some much older lesbian Israelis who read in English. We often read them aloud to each other on the kibbutz and always compared notes when we read them separately. When we each read Odd Girl Out in Israel, Ann Bannon's first book, and compared notes, Maybe we were just projecting, but we both wondered if it could possibly be a thinly disguised version of University of Illinois, our alma mater we just left to come abroad, where we had just spent our last undergraduate year together on campus, bravely speaking together before psych and human sexuality classes on our lesbian identity and relationship in those very early don't ask, don't tell days. The negative questions asked, the way lesbians were perceived, even by educators on a college campus, could be a whole presentation in itself. And now here we were in Israel, reading Odd Girl Out. Ann Bannon described the buildings and quadrangle of a big corn country Midwestern campus with a major military base a half hour away, a 2-hour train ride from a major Midwestern city. That certainly described University of Illinois in my mind. I decided that as soon as we got home to Champaign, I was going to find this Ann Bannon, no matter what it took. Of course, the books were totally forgotten and somewhat disreputable relics, nor did I know a thing about research and databases and other ways to find information would come decades later with the computer age. When we returned to the United States the next year and got back to Champaign, I spent my first few days searching in the university archives all day, going through yearbooks from University of Illinois looking for this Ann Bannon. In the yearbooks, I guess someone writing a book in the late 1950s could have been at University of Illinois. I would look in those years first, then reconnect with friends in the evening. Now, this was a complete shot in the dark because I was looking for someone who probably wasn't even named Ann Bannon, I later learned. No one would have dared write a lesbian pulp paperback novel under her own name, I later learned. A few days into this seemingly wild goose chase, something incredible happened. As we reunited with our many friends at night over beers, I sat one evening explaining my research to a friend. She asked me to repeat the author's name and said, "You know, I think my ex-lover Mary has an aunt or cousin or something who wrote books under that name." What? What? Of course, I got from her Mary's current local phone number and called her right away, right from the payphone in Murphy's Pub. Mary explained to me that yes, her cousin was Ann Bannon and had used that pseudonym to write a series of lesbian novels in the 1950s. But it wasn't something very many people knew. Apparently, it was a shameful family secret of sorts. As a youngster, Mary learned that her one generation older cousin had written some books under the name Ann Bannon, but her parents refused to tell her what the books were about. As a teenager in the 60s, starting to deal with her own lesbian feelings, she managed to pick up a paperback book about a lesbian from a drugstore rack. That book was Women in the Shadows by Ann Bannon. So then she knew. In the early 70s, Mary and her lover made a major road trip west and stopped and visited her cousin, the secret Ann Bannon. It soon became clear, however, that her cousin felt the same way the rest of the family had about those secret books she had written decades earlier. She wanted no part of that shameful part of her past. She was a married mother with 2 growing daughters of her own. Mary and her lover found themselves in a surprisingly uncomfortable situation on this visit and had to make sure they didn't even talk about the nature of their lesbian relationship to Mary's cousin, the secret former Ann Bannon. So that's where things stood when I spoke to Mary that night in 1979. I begged her to give me her cousin's address, or at least her real name, but she said no, her cousin didn't want to be associated with her Ann Bannon days and definitely wouldn't appreciate hearing from me. I tried every argument to get Mary to change her mind, but she wouldn't budge. There was nothing I could do. Fortunately, a few years later, something unrelated to my efforts was changing Ann Bannon's situation. In 1982, Barbara Greer, publisher at Naiad Press and a former reader and reviewer of Pulps as they came out, very determinedly tracked Ann Bannon down. Ann's life had moved far, far beyond the early 70s when Mary visited. Her children were grown, now her marriage had faltered, and she had gone back to school, gotten a PhD. Barbara then, and for the rest of her days, would consider this her greatest coup as a publisher, to reprint Ann Bannon, real name Ann Weldy. So Ann agreed to a publishing contract with this tiny little press, having no idea how much impact her books had already had and how greatly her life was about to change as a result. This is the first interview with her, promoted pre-publication by Barbara Greer to be published in the only LGBT wide-circulating weekly newspaper. These type of newspaper interviews were a version of a book tour for a small paperback publishing company. And for you historians, I want to read a small excerpt from the second very fresh interview soon after, which I always included in my longer show. I got a lot of letters. They were very touching, most of them, very supportive. Most of the time they were from women who, again, just went to the drugstore and happened to see one of the books. You get in line and try and hide them under your purse or whatever, your jacket. It was sort of like buying your first Kotex when you have to go up to a male clerk. Or they'd go into a library with open stacks, and they'd sneak down into the stacks and stand there and read a chapter a day. Then they'd run home and fix dinner for their kids and their husbands. Many of them, the essential message was, "Thank God I'm not alone." These are my feelings too. And many would describe their lives. They weren't trained writers, but they were stories from the heart. How will I cope with this? Now what will I do? And I was kind of abashed because I didn't know. I didn't know either. I had had a little experience, but really very little. I hadn't had a sustained relationship with a woman. I was flying on my fantasies. I did write back. I think I got back to everybody. Hundreds of letters came in over the 5 or 6 years the books were coming out. And I tried to be comforting and I tried to be reassuring. At least I could say, "You're not alone." But I could not then, as I can now, say, "There'll be a gay student union at your local university. There'll be social groups." The only outlet then where you knew you could meet people was the bar scene. And God, you couldn't do that if you were living in Cedar Rapids or Peoria, even if there had been a place to go. The communities were small enough that everybody would have known. The books did come out in other languages. There was a Portuguese edition in Brazil, a Norwegian edition, and a Dutch edition. So I began to get letters I couldn't read. I was hesitant to ask anyone to translate because I was afraid of what was going to be in the letters. But mostly, those women were able to hustle up a little English or have a friend translate. So with one thing and another, I got through them. The letters constitute a legacy that I lament to have to tell you is lost. I was afraid my children would find them. So, on one of our many moves in our early years, I just left them behind. I guess I just set them out to be picked up with the garbage. Subsequently, she's been republished many times by numerous publishers and become a pulp culture icon. From her books came an off-Broadway show called The Beebo Brinkers Chronicles, produced by Lily Tomlin and Jane Wagner in 1990, blah, blah, then also produced in other cities. Though she lives on the West Coast, she's even given Beebo Brinker tours of Greenwich Village when in New York City. And even in our little Louisville, Colorado in the 1980s, there was a lesbian-owned bookstore called Beebo's Books, after that same iconic Butch. Ann Bannon's been the featured guest at all sorts of conferences, led pride parades, and even the ultimate honor, had her books feted in academia, been translated into other languages, and otherwise celebrated in every way imaginable in our pop culture crazed world, as easily seen on annbannon.com. The 20-page Wikipedia entry Ann Bannon contains her full retrospective and self-described life story, all informed by being the secret Ann Bannon, hiding, closing, then opening the door again to her true self. She's legitimately crowned today the queen of the lesbian pulps. I must mention next my dear Valerie Taylor. the only openly lesbian author who dared to use her own name, or actually used her 1950s pulp pseudonym for the rest of her life. She wasn't hard to find, for she was and continued to be very activist in the lesbian community all her adult life, after leaving a bad marriage in her 30s. Out, daring, and never afraid, she raised 3 children on her own income in those risky take-your-kids-away days. Like Ann Bannon and Paula Christian, another lesbian pseudonymous author, following Ann Bannon's lead, Valerie's books were also paperback originals with sequeling in them. Her 5 lesbian pulp books were published between 1959 and 1964. Valerie found publication with a number of different publishers, hence was not as heavily promoted as the big money Fawcett Crest Gold Medal, where all of Ann Bannon's were published. With a sensibility, proud, social consciousness, she broke many stereotypes, and I always did a reading from her books. Both Valerie and Ann proved to be great letter writers. Valerie especially, many stories I could tell. But here's Valerie's last book. You'll notice that this one was published in 1964 by Midwood Tower, which was a sleazier later publisher. And you can see what the other books are around it. Gang Girl by Joan Ellis, Private Property by Brad Curtis, Party Time, and then her very sympathetic Journey to Fulfillment. By the mid-1960s and later, there wasn't much in them anymore but these hilarious, alliterative, hot, sexy scenes throughout and a marriage to a macho but understanding virile man at the end. But they were still great fun to read. And so a part of our history fizzled away and was largely forgotten until the 1980s and beyond. Now, normally my show would end with a little quiz and quotes from these 2 books, and then this. But in 2005, I had to change the ending of the show to the following ending that I'm still going to give you. In the summer of 2005, Lesbian Pulp Fiction, the only book to reprint excerpts from the Lesbian Pulps, finally came out. It was an anthology by Catherine Forrest, older than me, who had found the pulps as they came out when they were true survival lifelines for her and others of her generation. She dedicated it to Ann Bannon, writing, "For Ann Bannon with gratitude that has no bounds nor adequate words." I quickly scanned the table of contents and then settled in to read the introduction and start the book. She mentioned, Catherine Forrest did, that she was familiar with most of the authors, but that she had met a few additional ones in taking on this project. A week earlier, I'd received unannounced this book sent to me by my mother, unannounced and unexpected. It was written by a great aunt of mine who I'd only met one time when we went to the World's Fair in New York when I was in 4th grade, and typical of my bad relations with my mother that she would send it on to me unannounced. As it is, I'd spent 30 years of my adult life totally alienated and divorced from my immediate family and extended family by coming out when I had in the mid-1970s, when we would divorce our families of origin to go in the life, as it was called. Yet while living in the life where I belonged, I longed for family, spending those decades feeling like an orphan in those don't ask, don't tell days, never attending the many East Coast big life events and gatherings of my extended close Jewish family, the bar, bat mitzvahs, weddings, etc. I'd spent 3 decades living the life I'd first read in my pulps, a world divided, closeted at work, out of necessity in my all-male engineer profession while a lesbian entertainer and activist at home. Still feeling the tragic outsider, perhaps like Ann Bannon herself, whose early lesbian feelings then subsequently ended up informing her whole life story. I lived in a world divided. I was the legacy odd girl out. Meanwhile, from the 1960s forward, this aunt that my mother had just sent me a book signed by had been writing zillions of these, what she called family sagas, I would call them romances. Same types of books, each dedicated to a different set of extended family members. A very big deal in my no college education's large extended family to have a writer in the family and a book dedicated to each of their family groupings by name, such that my mom had found a used copy of this one of my aunt's books dedicated to me and my brothers, had lunch with her on her way back to Florida, and got it signed and promptly sent it to me. I'd opened the unexpected package, seen it was a book I'd never read, and set it aside on my desk without much more thought. With that puzzling "where have I heard this before" bell going off in my brain, when I looked harder at the book my mother had sent and at the one author that Catherine had said was new to her, never met before, mentioned in both her introduction and her acknowledgement, I realized a funny coincidence. I realized that the pen name of the author in Catherine's book, who she'd never met before or known about, and the book that I had the same common pen name, Julie Ellis. A very common pen name, I was sure, especially in my aunt's case. For the past 2 generations, our and most Jewish families had the habit of substituting out our very Jewish last name for a waspy-sounding ones at any opportunity, from writing a book to even waiting for a table in restaurants, fearing Cohen or Greenberg would disadvantage them. In our case, this would have been a common generic WASP cover-up last name for our very Jewish-sounding one. Nonetheless, I got online right away and Googled the words Julie Ellis author. This pulled up a web review I'd seen once before in my web surfing boredom one snowy day at home by a Pulps cover collector with an author named Julie Ellis, who did indeed write all sorts of what she called 1960s sleaze. Must have been the same person Catherine was referring to, for the early 1960s male interest publisher Midwood. I didn't collect Midwoods much at all because they were mostly just awful, so late in the pulp years, written by men for the most part, and just pure junk. This Julie Ellis being interviewed said she'd written under so many pseudonyms she couldn't even remember them all anymore. She said she'd written various combinations of Susan, Richards, middle names, various combinations, Jill Monty. Well, that Jill Monty actually was, going to my bookshelf, a book I did have by this sleaze writer Julie Ellis, apparently. It was been on my shelf for 25 years after picking it up in Israel. A World Divided in 1960-something or other had a happy ending, but it was not a Midwood. It was a Domino, a totally respected mainstream 1960s publisher. So apparently that sleaze writer had written that one. Next, I pulled out a couple of ancient versions of Barbara Greer's lesbian literature bibliography she put out before she started NIAID. Nope, there's no Julie Ellis. Only a Joan Ellis, some other unrelated common pseudonym. Well, I was sure it was all a funny coincidence that the woman who said she was a Midwood writer online had used the same pen name. She was clearly the one Catherine was referring to in her lesbian pulp fiction book. But I did call right away down to my mother in Florida to ask about this and about her visit to New York City. My mom had had lunch with my Aunt Julie, and I tried to pick my mom's brain on the details. Then I asked whether she thought that my great Aunt Julie could have written books like those I collect. My mom's a brassy kind of gal, but very much took offense. Absolutely not, she said. That name is just a coincidence. Your Aunt Julie is a very prim, gentle old lady who's a very successful writer of high quality, tasteful, good books. When I had lunch with her, she wore a hat and gloves. She's 15 years older than me, very successful writer, very tasteful, good books, and absolutely has never been gay. Then my mother admonished me that I should call and thank her for the autographed book, gave me her number to do so, and we hung up. It was too late to call New York by now, but my mind was absolutely racing. Surely there was no connection, couldn't be. I even made a late-night call to Toronto, Canada, to my only other collector friend who collected raunchier, later stuff than me, and asked what she thought, but neither of us could make anything of that. So the next morning, as soon as the time difference allowed, I called my 86-year-old aunt, who I'd never spoken to as an adult and had only met once when I was 10 years old and visiting New York with my family, and shyly introduced myself and thanked her for the signed book. She told me that my mother had said I loved to read and that she'd been glad to sign it, and chatted a bit more. And I told her yes, I was a big reader and had a collection of antiquarian paperbacks. And then, with some trepidation, actually considerable trepidation with my family, I asked her the big question. I asked if she might have written a book called A World Divided under the name jan10. And in her quavery, very sweet old lady voice, she asked me who the publisher was. And I told her Domino. And she said, why, yes, I wrote a few books for Domino, a British publisher, I think, yes. And now that she thought of it, she did write for them with the pen name jan10. So I asked her the bigger question. Had she ever written for a publisher called Midwood in the 1960s? And the answer was, why, yes, she wrote zillions of books for them, mostly pretty sleazy stuff. But that's how she got her start as an author that launched her writing career into Gothics and then her family sagas. Yes, yes, oh my God. I'd been collecting, researching, and educating on the lesbian pulps for 30 years, and I just figured out that my own aunt wrote sympathetic lesbian pulps, including one that had been on my shelf for 30 years. My aunt told me no one else in the family knew of her Midwood writing lesbian pulps at all, except her kids, who were actually just a couple years younger than me. She said they'd hated those books, though it paid for their private school Manhattan educations and her single parents' sole income. As we spoke more, she explained that because of Catherine Forrest's new lesbian pulp fiction, she'd been invited to do a panel with two other still living lesbian pulp writers at the New York City Gay Literature Club at their gay center. Would I like to come? Would I? You bet I went. Ill health of the other two elderly New York area lesbian pulp authors canceled the actual once-in-a-lifetime panel soon after I bought my plane ticket. But I had a fantastic visit with my very sweet, very liberal, warm and tender 86-year-old aunt, who welcomed me as large connected family always does. The other two authors who canceled were Sally Singer, who wrote as March Hastings in Midwood Days, and the New York City writer still writing, long after that, right up until last year, I believe, Mary Jane Meeker. My aunt told me she was especially happy to be included in Catherine's anthology because she had been the one who stayed in touch with everyone from Midwood, and Sally Singer had called her excitedly in the 1980s saying Naiad Press was looking to reprint their lesbian pulps. But Barbara Greer, all eager when she had called her, turned out to be unwilling to reprint her books along with the others when she learned my aunt wasn't gay. My aunt explained and shrugged, laughing. She'd had a long career of her own, was still writing. Barbara Greer had a commissioned, after she died, biography, which is titled Indomitable, so that should give you some idea. And yes, because she was one of the most prolific authors at Midwood, writing a book a week practically, she had bucked her bosses at Midwood to insist on happy endings that the male writers, even the actual lesbians on staff, wouldn't and couldn't risk. And of course, Midwood had no desire to have happy lesbian endings in their books. And she told me she often got appreciative letters, especially from some lesbian group in Boston that wrote often asking when her next lesbian book was coming out. She told me she'd also written and produced a positive lesbian play in 1959 in Greenwich Village, though she'd had a hard time finding actresses willing to appear in it at the time. Everyone was afraid to, whether they were lesbian or not. And now that there was interest and appreciation of her lesbian pulps writing, she was combing her file of manuscripts for that 1959 lesbian play. She had floor-to-ceiling books that she had written and published in every room in her small Manhattan good address apartment. She told me that with this new revival interest, she and another lesbian pulps writer had been the featured guests a year earlier at the New York City Paperback Collectors Convention. People had brought in piles of paperback original books for each of them to sign. Of course, she had a lot more for them to sign because she wrote everything under the sun. And that they, both understated, gentle, grandmotherly types, they'd become friends. She and Anne Bannon, which is how Catherine Forrest found my aunt. So I wrote Anne and Catherine, of course. Anne sent me a picture of the two of them together. And here's a little more from Catherine in her acknowledgments, as well as what she had said in her intro. I learned my aunt spent most weekends at the Montauk second home with her two adult children. They both lived close by, neither married, but still hated that she was getting any attention for writing those early sleaze books. She'd lost a whole box of them in a basement flood in Montauk, and that too was probably a relief to her children. But she wanted to give me any for which she had duplicates. And of course, she signed all of those. Aunt Julie died in her sleep at home of an overnight stroke just 3 months after our visit. She had 3 unfinished books she was in the middle of writing and never did find that 1950s lesbian play she'd written and produced.
Imagine my surprise. I love that I found you, but I ache all over wanting to know your every dream. Imagine my surprise to find that I love you, feeling warm all over, knowing that you've been alive. Imagine my surprise to find that I love you, feeling warm all over, knowing that you've been alive, knowing that you've been in my